Welcome to the CEC Report, the weekly program of political and economic analysis from the Citizens Electoral Council. I'm Robert Barwick, and I'm joined again by CEC founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
Today, we have a very important topic to discuss. It's what we have just exposed in the very latest edition of our publication, The New Citizen: Defeat the British Crown's Green Fascist Dictatorship. So today we're going to talk about how the British Crown created Green Fascism. Let me begin by talking about the environment. Care for the environment is the new creed of our society. It's like the 11th commandment. And you're not going to find anyone to argue with that. Of course, we care for the environment. But what does it mean? What we tend to see is that people who live in large cities, and especially school children, are fixated on this. But people in Australia who live in areas that are rural areas that are primarily there for production purposes, or people who work in industries that greenies oppose, tend to see the other side of environmentalism.
And pretty quickly.
Well, they quickly discover that what is called conservation has a very anti-human bent to it. And the bottom line is, conservation as it reigns today is just a cover for a vicious hatred of human activity that has one objective. And that objective, Craig, is population reduction.
And not just small population reduction. We're talking about the British Crown's deliberate and very public announcements that it intends to reduce the population from the current 7 billion down to below 1 billion people, which is really insane when you think about it. But this is the nature of the British Crown. And people will say, well, why would they want to do that? I mean, what on earth would possess them to do that? Now, this is not a new program as all of a sudden happened. This has been going on for the last 40 to 50 years as a deliberate program, and we'll say more about that in a minute. But what's at stake here? What the reason for it is that you have the British Crown, and its adoption or its existence is as an oligarchy. It believes, the Queen and Prince Philip both believe that they are ordained by God, by the gods, I should say.
The gods, yeah.
The gods, to reign over human beings of the world. And frankly, what happens is that too many people become a threat to them, because human beings are created in the image of what we call imago Dei. They're created with creative reason in the image of God, and that we have the ability to transform our environment through the use of science and technology. So therefore, if we promote the use of science and technology, if we promote education, if we actually really give human beings the capability to make discoveries of the universe, these oligarchs lose power.
Now, there's a metaphorical example of this. And the funny thing is, it may not just be metaphorical, but the story of the actual gods of Olympus and Zeus has a historical foundation. And Aeschylus wrote a trilogy, Prometheus Bound, where Prometheus was sort of like a dare I say it, a Christ character. He was a god and a mortal, and he defied Zeus. Zeus had said humans cannot have fire because of how it would help them to develop.
Which, that's sort of like a metaphor today for nuclear power.
That's right. So Prometheus stole fire, gave it to mankind, for which he was punished by the gods for the rest of time.
Yeah, he was chained to a rock and had an eagle come out every day and pick out his liver. I mean, you want to talk about nasty torture, but that actually captured the mindset of these oligarchs.
Because what Prometheus saw different to Zeus was that human beings had a potential to develop and should be able to, but Zeus knew that if they did, they would be less at the mercy of the gods. Now that's a metaphor, but we have printed in this paper actual newspaper headlines from Australian papers from the 60s and 70s, where the Queen herself and Prince Philip, in his own words, have said, we need to stop scientific discovery.
And that's really awesome when you think about that. So many people believe that the Queen is such a or Prince Philip are harmless figures. You know, he's a doddering old person. But he has been at the forefront of the creation of green fascism ever since the post-war period. Many people may not recognise that now Hitler gave eugenics, the idea of getting rid of certain select groups of people, a bad name because of what he did to the Jews, the Gypsies and the Christians and the others in the gas chambers, right? So the word eugenics was given a bad name, but the eugenics was reinvented by the very same people that were pushing it into the idea of environmentalism.
Now, eugenics was always committed to the goal of population control and population reduction. So now environmentalism is based on that. Given that that's its intention, to actually reduce the numbers of human beings, we can't be surprised that the way the green movement operates is an actually fascist, with an actually fascist outlook. They are as fascist as the Nazis, etc. So I'll give a couple of examples, but to bring it home for Australians.
Well, I think it's when we say fascist, it can be seen as a bit of a glib term, but we're being very precise here. We are referring to people that deny that man is created in God's image, that man has this creative spark, and that man are nothing more than animals with a carrying capacity, that man is polluting the earth. This is the sort of fascists that we're talking about. And again, Hitler was created out of the green shirts movement, or the brown shirts movement was created out of the green shirts movement, the environmentalist movement in the 19s and 20s in Germany. If he didn't have that space of support, which again was supported by the oligarchy, then he wouldn't be able to exist in power.
We'll cover some of this a little bit further down today, but just from what you just said, consider this: the carbon tax, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority plan that we are leading the fight against, the media inquiry, which is a strange one because Bob Brown says, "Oh, you got to stop the Murdoch media," but they want to bring in rules for all the media,
which includes us.
Which includes us. Peer review behind climate change science. If it's not peer reviewed, it's not real.
Reviewed, as we call it.
Peer reviewed, that's right. But what does that mean? That the people have to accept what an elite say, right? There can be nothing outside of that. And even the example where a well-known journalist in Australia, who I know in some respects is anti-fascist because she was a strong voice against John Howard's police state anti-terror laws, for example. When Al Gore's movie came out, and Inconvenient Truth, she called for climate change denial to be made a crime, like the Germans make Holocaust denial a crime, because she said the consequences will be another Holocaust and otherwise. In other words, you should not be allowed to deny these things. So these are examples of fascism. The people have to accept what this elite tell them is for their own good, which means going into that gas chamber in effect.
This is becoming really bad in the schools, because recently, you have this situation where a school in Queensland was given access to satellite tracking or satellite vision, where it was actually spying upon Borneo about the destruction of rainforests for the orangutan.
And they would call up.
This is spying on a sovereign country.
And they would call up feral eco-terrorists on the ground in Borneo to go and combat the locals who were doing this land clearing.
This is fascism. And school kids are being indoctrinated with this as a method.
Absolutely. All right, well, with that introduction, we have to take a break. When we come back, we're going to give you the history of this, just to give you a taste of what's in this paper. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing how the British Crown created green fascism. Now, Craig, the first thing people have to know is what the Crown is. It is the Queen and the royal family, but it's an institution, right? So we've recently, a couple of years ago, we printed an edition of our paper, that one there, if you want to hold it up. Defeat the British Empire of Monetarism, where we give the pedigree of the Crown. The British Crown is modelled on the Venetian system, and Venice was ruled over by a doge. That's a variation of the word duke. But the doge was elected, He didn't hand down his authority by hereditary, and he was answerable to the collective of the Venetian aristocracy, right? And from 1688 onwards, the British crown was reworked on the same way, where the British royal family is the figurehead for the City of London. So it's a financier oligarchy.
Except they weren't elected; they were just imposed.
No, exactly.
Unfortunately.
But if the British Crown, back in 1994, when we first exposed the World Wildlife Fund through the Executive Intelligence Review magazine, LaRouche made the point that he called it the coming fall of the House of Windsor. If this royal family ceases to be useful to the oligarchy, they'll replace them.
Yeah.
Right? So at the moment, so what's the oligarchy want? That's the key thing here. Well, the model is the East India Company. And we go through the details of this in that paper, which people should look up. But the East India Company was the world's biggest ever private monopoly. It was the British Empire. The empire was based on the territory conquered by the company, and the British government represented the company in international affairs, such as the 1763 Treaty of Paris. And it was out of this East India Company, which was sort of Benjamin Disraeli, and a British Prime Minister in the 1800s. He wrote about this Venetian takeover of Britain. His family was part of it, and he called it the Venetian Party. And the Venetian Party was centred in the East India Company. And it was the East India Company, Craig, that employed Thomas Malthus to write his political economic justification for genocide. And that's exactly what Malthus was about.
Which today comes down to the same policies: free trade and globalisation. And we hear about the opium wars, or the opium trade that was run through the British East India Company. The slave trade, the British slave trade was initially run through the British East India Company. I mean, these are policies that have come down to us today. So when we talk about the free trade policies, the modern free trade policies, there's not one exact difference between these policies and these policies of the Venetian-sponsored British East India Company. And
from about the year 1800 on, the entire leadership of the East India Company was trained by Thomas Malthus, and that applied to the way they ran the Irish famine. They ran the opium wars, as you've said. They had Malthus's ideas. What were Malthus's ideas? They're the basis of the Green Movement. Malthus said, and he was wrong. He said that food supply will always grow, or population will always grow faster than food supply. He said what we've got to do is work out a way that for every baby born, there's a person who dies, because we have to keep the population static in that way. And it was from his ideas that Darwin came up with his notion of natural selection. Mm-hmm. Darwin's natural selection gave birth to the philosophy and ideas of eugenics. And this was the idea that natural selection has governed the evolution of species. Human beings need to work out a way to use the principles of natural selection on the human species so that genetically we advance, stay strong, etc. And famous people in Australia, like one of the, probably the guy who's regarded as our greatest ever scientist, Macfarlane Burnet, who advocated chemical and biological warfare against Asian countries to our north to reduce their population.
He was the guy that discovered myxomatosis for rabbits.
He's the guy who applied myxomatosis to rabbits.
Yeah, but he was also talking about using that to Asian populations.
Exactly. What he did to rabbits, he wanted that to be done to Asian populations.
Yes, I mean, this guy was a real rabbit eugenicist and a racist.
And if you read him, he was obsessed with this idea of perfecting the gene pool of human beings using Darwinian natural selection, i.e. eugenics, and he was the head of the Eugenics Society.
Wasn't he made an Order of Australia
a knight, and Prince Philip wrote the foreword to his book.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So Darwin's eugenics begat Hitler, right? And as you've already said, it was Hitler who gave eugenics a bad name. So contemporaries of Hitler, British contemporaries of Hitler, Julian Huxley, Arthur Tansley, an absolute kook, and Nicholson, the head of the British Nature Conservancy, they were the people that Prince Philip organised together to start the green movement as we know it today through the World Wildlife Fund. And what we've done in this paper is take that on from there. The World Wildlife Fund has one objective, and Prince Philip is the guy who keeps saying what that objective is: population control, population reduction.
He'd love to come back as a deadly virus to make a contribution to overpopulation. He said that. That's his modus operandi. He's absolutely obsessed with this idea of population control.
Now, Craig, we've documented also how the World Wildlife Fund, if you look at its activities in Africa especially, is responsible for actual genocide, not theoretical genocide of, we're going to do this. They've been doing it already.
Well, that's right. I mean, because the point with the Africans is that they use the African conservation parks as ways of setting up conservation preserves, but they've also been guilty of sponsoring the literal assassination and killing of people in and around those areas. So, I mean, we go through in great detail in that in Other New Citizens about the way that the World Wildlife Fund has used the conservation movement specifically to kill people. And it's very, very explicit. It's really quite shocking.
And in recent times, in the last couple of decades, there's been a number of exposés come out to show the way that the African people have been abused, absolutely abused, in the name of conservation.
That's 10 pence in the panda, isn't it?
10 pence in the panda.
Yeah.
And the point is, though, when you watch it, what Australians have to realise is what's happening in the Murray-Darling Basin now
Exactly the same.
is exactly the same.
What's happening in the Murray-Darling Basin is the same land clearance process of Scottish Highlands, of African game parks, preserves, and of the Irish, and the Irish potato famine. It's the same modus operandi. There is absolutely no difference when you study history and you look at it, and it's the only difference, well, there's no difference. The singularity, it's the British Crown that's doing it, through the British, either through, in the early days, the British East India Company, but today it's directly done through the conservation movement, run by Prince Philip directly.
All right, so with that by way of background, when we come back, we're going to bring it home to Australia and talk about how it's working how it was set up in Australia and how it's working here now. Welcome back to the CEC's discussion of how the British Crown created Green Fascism. Now, Craig, when we talked recently about the Murray-Darling Basin and the fight there, we strongly suspect that when the Queen visited Australia in October for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and she had her private meetings at Government House with Opposition Leader Tony Abbott and Prime Minister Gillard and whoever else, she discussed there the plan to shut down the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, that seems a rather outrageous thing to say. Why do we suspect that? Well, you've got to know the amazing story, the shocking story of how hands-on the royal family, Prince Philip and the Queen, were from the 1960s onward in creating the green movement in Australia.
And it's a story that's not being told, Robbie.
Except by us?
Except by us.
So we've documented it.
In
and when we
detail.
researched it, it blew us away.
Yeah.
Just to give you some of the overview, it was a royal tour in 1963 that Prince Philip said Australia needs a branch of my World Wildlife Fund. He ordered the Governor-General's permanent private secretary to organise it. And that guy's job, he used the resources of the Office of Governor-General to bring together big business, bring together the scientists like the CSIRO, etc., and create the Australian Conservation Foundation. Prince Philip ordered the Australian government to fund it. They got the Chief Justice of the High Court, Sir Garfield Barwick, no relation to me, to be its first president. And the reason they did that was so Barwick would have the maximum leverage over the government, because as the Justice of the High Court, governments had to try and get legislation past him.
And he used that influence.
He absolutely used that influence. And so between Prince Philip and Barwick, and of course Barwick's one of the highest ranking knights in Australia, a real favourite of the royal family, they set up the ACF, got it going, and then they deployed it as a weapon against the state governments. And that was important because state governments are in charge of the area that conservation falls under, right? And the first example was what they did to Tasmania, where they tried to stop the building of the Gordon Dam that flooded Lake Pedder, and they heavied the Tasmanian government in an extreme way, to the point where the Premier of Tasmania, Eric Rees, a real Australian patriot, had a shouting match with Prince Philip behind closed doors, right, back in 1972, an amazing story. These people are not figureheads. They use their power like bullies. What we talk about in here, Craig, though, as an aside, is their own analysis of the Crown's power. They call themselves the chameleon Crown. They just exist in the background so no one sees it, but they use it. Out of all this came the Wilderness Society, came the Greens Party of Bob Brown, came the Wentworth Group, which is the big group leading the Tim Flannery's outfit.
Of scientists behind all the promotion for the MDBA.
Scientists.
Shutdown. So-called scientists.
That all came out of everything Prince Philip did. And so now we've got things like, and it's the same people, you see them popping up all the time.
A small group, it's just not a mass, it's just a very small group, extremely well funded.
We first came across Tim Flannery back in 1994.
Yeah, he came across because there was a conference, I think it was the Australian Academy of Sciences, which was talking about population in 2040. He stood up and said Australia can only support a population, as a paleontologist, someone who studies dead things, of 6 to 7 million people.
And it's an example where their obsession with population is what they base their science on. That comes first, right? People should watch the episode we've done of this show on why Australia needs 100 million people. But Craig, Flannery has a buddy, a German named Professor Hans Schellenhuber, who's also works for the Queen. He is her personal private envoy on climate change. And it's Schellenhuber who has recently come out with the shocking announcement that the world population needs to be drastically cut back. What's he saying?
Down to 1 billion people, but the Queen knighted this guy for his services to sciences. So he's not just some arbitrary figurehead. This person is working directly under the auspices of the Crown. Otherwise he wouldn't be knighted. But he's come out, and you're right, he said we have to reduce the population not down to 2 billion as Prince Philip has said, but down to below 1 billion.
Now my question for you is, with all this heating up, why now? Why are we seeing a flurry of this now?
Because the world's financial and monetary system is disintegrating. The other side of this green fascism is this idea of privatisation and globalisation that we talked about before. The British Empire exists on what we call monetarism, the control of money through central banks in order to control populations. But as we see in Europe, you're seeing the whole country's being now taken over by this monetarist operation. You see the elected government of Italy's being run by technocrats from Goldman Sachs.
But it's their system that's collapsing. That's why they have to do this.
That's their system's going down. So you've got Greece, you've got Italy, they're all being run because their system's coming down. But this is why they have to promote the control of the population even more through these fascist means, is because they're losing control.
They're determined, aren't they, to make sure that sovereign governments don't take steps against the financial crisis that put their people first.
That's exactly right. And if people were to wake up and actually realise that these people aren't quite as powerful as they think they are, if you can actually talk about what's going on like we have, then you take off the shackles, you take off the blinds towards what's actually really going on.
Okay, so we can only give you a foretaste of what you'll discover when you read this publication. Read it in depth. It's 56 pages, but that's good. There's more to know. And if you need copies, order them from us at the CEC. So that's it for this week. Tune in again for more of the CEC Report.